Hey there, and welcome back to TingleCon 2022. I'm Nathan ASMR, and I'm joined by Giulia Poerio. And today we're going to be talking about the science of ASMR. So we've talked about this in the past cons, and I think it'd be really interesting to just catch up on some of the research, what they've been up to since last year, because we did interview Giulia last year, and just in general go through some of the questions from the audience and just some of my own questions and sort of see what's going on with ASMR in the science world. So with that all said, why don't we just dive into this? And I think this is pretty much, I have to ask this question, but how did you get into ASMR as a fan? And then also, how did that sort of transition into the studying of the science of ASMR?
Yeah, I mean, it's really very much a kind of research type thing. So I've always had ASMR. I didn't know that it was a thing. I didn't know that, people other than me experienced it. I thought it was a very strange thing that only I had when I was younger. And then I found out I think it was about 2013, that it's got a name, and lots of people experience this. And there's this whole community online of people who create content so that you can access this feeling on demand. So at that point, in 2013, there hadn't been any research really into ASMR, even though there was a name for it. And that really got me thinking, right, well, there needs to be something, right? There needs to be some research. And that's what I got started on, was started to do some initial research into ASMR, and specifically looking at the underlying physiology. So what's going on in the body when people experience ASMR.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very much a personal story.
I think a lot of people can relate to that story as well. I think it's definitely, it's almost like ASMR didn't even exist before. I think maybe it was 2009 or something like around that year. There's some whispering community before that, but yeah, it is just so interesting to have such a new phenomenon. And so why don't we sort of transition into maybe what ASMR is in terms of scientifically speaking, what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, so I can tell you how I define ASMR, and people obviously define it in different ways as well. And people might have different experiences of what ASMR is, but for me, ASMR is a term used to describe a specific kind of feeling, and it's that feeling that I'm interested in trying to understand. So the feeling itself is kind of, very relaxing, tingling sensation that originates at the scalp and then can spread down. And there are often a common set of triggers. Even though there are kind of personal tastes and preferences, there do seem to be a common set of things that will induce this feeling in people. So that's typically how I define it, and that's what I'm interested in looking at. I'm interested in looking at people who are capable of experiencing this tingling sensation in response to these specific kind of triggers, and also kind of what's going on during that tingling, and what's specific about it.
So when we're talking about that tingling, I mean, maybe this kind of leads me into this next question, but how can we kind of understand it? I mean, is it simply a biological response? Is this something that's neurological? Is this, is it psychological? What is the origin of this feeling? Is it, from what at least the research shows?
Oh, really, it's such a good question, and I don't think we have the answer to it just yet. But it's likely to involve lots of different things. I mean, we have some pretty good evidence showing that there are physiological changes happening when people who say they experience ASMR report experiencing it in response to ASMR content. So we know things about what's going on with heart rate, which tends to reduce, which is consistent with this idea that ASMR is this kind of relaxing thing. And also we get skin conductance level increases. So the sweating of the skin kind of increases when people watch ASMR videos if they're ASMR sensitive. That suggests as well to us that ASMR is quite a complex emotion. So it involves kind of activating and deactivating states. And this kind of relates to what people say about ASMR as being something that's euphoric, but also deeply relaxing, which can seem kind of contradictory. But the physiological data seems to back that up. We're now doing studies specifically looking at what's happening when people experience the tingling in ASMR. So we're asking people to watch content and tell us when they're experiencing ASMR, and we're trying to see what the physiological pattern is like during those specific experiences rather than over the course of a 3-minute ASMR video, for example. Expectation probably does play a role, and attention probably plays a role, because it's not like there's not this kind of one-to-one mapping of an ASMR trigger and the ASMR experience, right? So it's not like if you're ASMR sensitive, every time you hear tapping, you'll experience ASMR, right? It's much more complicated than that. So in that sense, attention and saliency probably plays a role, and expectation too. I mean, a lot of people say that if they want to experience ASMR, it might be less likely to happen for them. And there are also things like habituation effects. So if you overexpose yourself to ASMR content, you're less likely to get them. So there's likely multiple things at play. So there's physiological underlying kind of physiology that's going on, but there's also probably top-down cognitive processes that are playing a role in how people experience it.
Wow, that's fascinating. I didn't think about that expectation aspect, but that's definitely the attention is definitely another aspect of the puzzle there, because it is, then you get the tingle immunity, which does come from probably over anticipation. You're like, you're it's almost like a drug you've done too much. There is like that expectation it kind of removes a little bit of the intensity of the experience. And that's really fascinating. I think actually I'd want to just jump back, because I think I didn't give you a chance to maybe just introduce yourself in terms of what you've sort of done. And I think actually what I'll do is just put this at the beginning, because I think it's important for people to know. But what's your background with ASMR outside of, as a fan and somebody who's how you jumped into it, but what exactly would you, your short little bio to everyone so they know who you are, basically.
Yeah, so I'm a psychologist by training, and I work as a lecturer, which means I teach, but I also do lots of research, and ASMR is one of the things that I do research on. And I'm really interested in trying to understand ASMR as a complex emotional state. So a lot of the research that I've done in the past looks at emotion. So I'm primarily an emotion science researcher, and ASMR fits quite nicely into that as a complex but very understudied emotion, and a specific one at that. So I'm very interested in looking at, what are the differences between people who experience ASMR and people who don't? What is ASMR like as a complex emotion? How can we describe it? How can we measure it? And all those kinds of things. So there's lots of interesting things on ASMR that I'm doing, and I'm going to continue to do, which is great.
That's really, really interesting. Yeah, and always the people who don't experience it, that's such an important test group there, because that is a large percentage, I'm guessing, of the population. But you also have so much anecdotal experience, because people are posting on the internet so many comments and things. So there's so much evidence to support it in that regards. Well, let's jump back then here, because I think this is important. You mentioned the tingling and everything, but is the relaxation aspect an essential part of, I've actually had this debate with some other ASMR artists, but is relaxation an essential component of ASMR, in your opinion?
It's a good question. I think it being pleasurable is a core defining feature. So a lot of people might say, oh, I get that, I get that feeling of shivers down my spine when, there's something cringeworthy or something like that, right? But I would say that isn't ASMR. So I would define ASMR as a positive, pleasurable emotion. So whether that relaxation has to be a part of that, I think most people would probably say that it is an element of it. But the question is, why is that relaxation happening? Yeah. Is it that you're getting the tingling and the relaxation is a response to the tingling? Because the tingling itself may not be what's relaxing, the after effects of it might be. So we really need to understand the dynamics of what's going on when somebody experiences ASMR. And is it maybe that the ASMR bit is the tingling and the relaxation is what comes after the tingling? Or is it all kind of, muddled in there and it's a relaxation tingling? We don't know. And that's why I think it's important to kind of look at what's happening, when somebody's experiencing the onset of the tingling and how long it lasts and the duration of it and what's going on there. But I would say for the most part, people would probably say that it's a relaxing thing. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think it's essential?
Well, I think I would say there are a few artists in the cinematic realm. I don't want to necessarily specifically name them, but we've just had sort of intellectual conversations just regards to, is that an inherent part of ASMR? Because I think there are some people who wouldn't say they feel ASMR, but they feel relaxation. Mm-hmm. So I do think in some way relaxation content and ASMR do get lumped together in some ways. maybe in the sense that this is relaxing cinematic stuff. So this person feels like, well, it's not necessarily the specific tingling that, that I think a lot of people define as ASMR. So I would say that is probably, at least that's the perspective I've kind of heard. And I think it is compelling in the sense that from a purely intellectual, heady kind of position, like, I guess you could separate the two, maybe the relaxation and the, like you said, I do think the pleasurable angle is probably a better word. Probably just the sense that it is, relaxation is pleasurable. So I guess that would apply there rather than just necessarily the specific tingling sensation. And actually, I was going to ask you, do you think, what about music frisson? Is that related to, for those who don't know, that's the tingles that you feel on your skin when you listen to music that you love. But do you think there's a relationship there between ASMR and then we can jump into some of your current studies and everything?
Yeah, I think a frisson or music-induced chills, as people can call it, or aesthetic experiences. So if you feel, very moved, you might get that frisson if you hear an inspiring speech or something. And that's a complex emotional experience that a lot of people say that they can relate to. So not everybody has this as well. Like some people don't get chills in response to music ever. So in some senses, it's like ASMR in the sense that it's a complex emotional response that is non-universal. So not everybody experiences it. And there do seem to be some parallels there. So if you're somebody who experiences ASMR, you're more likely to experience chills and frisson type experiences, and the same the other way around, right? So there appears to be this correlation, this correlation between complex experiences, right? But I think many people would say that ASMR is a different experience to chills. Predominantly, it feels very different. So chills tend to be very activating, and they're associated with kind of different physiological changes. They also appear to be associated with piloerection, which is hair standing on end. Not always, but they're commonly associated with that, and they, on the arms and legs and things like that. Whereas ASMR is very much a kind of head orientated, at least for most people. So there do appear to be some differences in terms of the actual emotional experience. And of course, the stimuli that trigger them are different, right? So music versus ASMR triggers. And of course, ASMR triggers don't necessarily induce ASMR at all times. And I think this comes back to your point about, is ASMR relaxing? And I think there's a difference between an ASMR trigger and the sensation of ASMR itself. And some people might find ASMR triggers very unnerving, right? And they might not get an ASMR response. But if they're experiencing, shivers down the spine of disgust in response to ASMR triggers, that's not ASMR, at least as I would define it. Right?
Absolutely. And I think this actually kind of transitions into another important point that I think we should just cover, because I think some of the criticism that you might see, especially as a creator, not necessarily particularly I do a lot of history and formative, but in other sort of genres of ASMR, I think there's a criticism leveled where maybe it's sexual in nature, where, you do see some of these things. Do you think that plays a role into ASMR in any way? Or is, like you said, is that maybe that's a different physiological response completely?
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because if you're not somebody that experiences ASMR and you're not aware of that feeling firsthand, and you watch a typical ASMR video, maybe that includes some kind of role play elements, like doctor's examination, often close personal attention and this kind of intimacy is part of the ASMR experience. It's one of the main triggers, right? But if you're not somebody who gets that, tingling relaxation from it, and you can't recognize it from very early on in your life, you might think, oh my gosh, what is this kind of intimacy happening on the screen, right? Like, this is somehow like a sexual fetish type thing. And it's something that people say often. But again, they are conflating ASMR on YouTube or ASMR triggers with ASMR as a feeling. Now, of course, it is entirely possible that you could get sexually aroused by ASMR content, but that feeling is sexual arousal. It's not ASMR. And they're different things. And we also have asked people in our research whether they feel sexually aroused. And there's no reason to suggest that ASMR triggers or the feeling of ASMR is a sexual one. And that's not to say that you couldn't get turned on by ASMR content. And, there may be kind of parallels between kind of interpersonal context and the things that people find arousing, but ASMR as a feeling is a non-sexual one.
And I think that's probably comparable to other forms of art. I mean, you look at music and film. I mean, you could, I guess, get turned on by music in some way by an artist who's overtly sexualized, but at the same time, it's not, I think that's a stylistic thing more than necessarily, like you said, it's the feeling versus just the presentation. And that's an important distinction there. Thank you so much for talking on that. I want to do about 10 more minutes, and then I'm going to leave about 20 minutes to talk about like kind of where things are in 2022 and your research and everything. But I think that I think it's important to talk about just a couple other things here, because I know there's a lot of people in the ASMR community who have strong feelings on these things. And so there's really two specifically. And one is, what do you think about the relationship between ASMR and being neurodivergent, for example? Or is there one?
I mean, it's a really good question. And I can't say that there's any research out there that has looked into this yet. I'm not aware of any. It may be that there is some, but I'm not aware of it. So I don't know if there is a correlation between neurodivergence. Again, it probably depends on what you mean by that, right, as well.
Yeah, of course.
But anecdotally, I mean, anecdotally, people say that they can use ASMR stimuli for things like stimming in autism. But I mean, I don't know is the answer, and I suspect more research needs to be done. I mean, what's the kind of feeling in the ASMR community? Do you get a sense of this?
I would say that it varies, but I would say there definitely is within the ASMR community a strong neurodivergent. I guess you would call it just a group that I'm friends with many of them, and so I hear anecdotally again similarly that it does seem to be something that is quite useful. And there's definitely at least a relationship in terms of the people who consume ASMR. Certainly not. I would say maybe it's just similarly to the typical percentage of the population in general. But I do think there does seem to be something there. I wouldn't say it's a really strong correlation, but it's certainly something that I have heard from others. So I would say, it was thought I'd mention it. And also we had spoke to Clau last year and I was like, well, I think she had mentioned she was studying this as well. So, I wanted to bring it up.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because, I guess you could ask two broad questions. Are people with kind of neurodivergent traits more likely to be people who experience ASMR? Is there that connection? Or is ASMR content helpful for people for X, Y, and Z, right? And they're two different questions.
Right, absolutely.
But in terms of the research base, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think even something like autism spectrum is so diverse as there's so many different traits and things that are going on. For example, sensory sensitivity is often an issue in autism spectrum. And we know, for example, that people with ASMR have heightened sensory sensitivity. So that might be a kind of a third variable explanation of the potential relationship between the two. Maybe it's that actually people with ASMR and people, who've got sensory sensitivity issues, or there's that overlap somewhere in there.
Absolutely. So I think I want to ask, and I think, again, you will probably just this will touch into some of the other things we're talking about here, but the clinical uses of ASMR, I think that's probably and then we'll jump into your research, but I think that's just such an important thing to emphasize. What do you think? I mean, you mentioned you do come from an emotional, psychological background in terms of studies. How do you feel those two? What's the relationship there? Is there a place for ASMR in clinical use?
It's a really good question, and it's something that I get asked a lot about. And I think, first of all, I would say is that anecdotally, people are already using ASMR for many different things. So there's a huge kind of anecdotal evidence base out there suggesting that ASMR is useful for people on an individual basis. What we don't yet have is the kind of the big studies that look at this in a kind of controlled way. So doing things like randomized controlled trials, looking at ASMR as a tool, right? And that's something that we really need a lot more research on to see whether it might be effective, what it's going to be effective for, and how it works. But when I think about ASMR as a potential kind of therapy or for use, I tend to think of it in terms of kind of music therapy and sound therapy and how that is currently used. So that's quite well accepted in various clinical settings. And I see no reason why ASMR couldn't become like that one day. I guess the problem is that people can have really differing responses to ASMR content. So what you don't want to do is assume that ASMR content works the same for everybody, because of course it doesn't. And it might be this idea that, just applying ASMR, if you're not somebody that's capable of experiencing it, could do more harm than good, right? So we need to think about, maybe it's only beneficial if you do get that relaxation response. But I think that there are a big group out there of people who engage with ASMR content and use it for various different things, who don't get the tingling response and who just get that relaxation, right? So it could be that more universally, different types of ASMR triggers could be used to help soothe and do all sorts of things, in the same way that relaxing classical music is often used in healthcare settings. So I just think we need more research on it, and we don't have that at the moment.
And I do tend to think of it in the same way. I do think there's a relationship between, and like the sound of the ocean waves, for example, something like that. There's a relationship there. And of course, it's worth mentioning misophonia, which is the hatred of certain sounds. There's definitely seems to be some relationship there in a yin and yang kind of way. So let's go ahead and just jump into kind of where things are in 2022. So why don't we, I happen to just know how this has kind of progressed over the past year or so, but for those who don't know, what is the state of ASMR research in 2022? And maybe do you want to take a moment to just talk about your Delphi study that you're working on as well?
Yeah. So what's really great is that more and more research is kind of getting published. So it's really picking up speed. So I've certainly noticed a lot more papers coming out, and there's been some really interesting ones from people other than myself who do research. So there was recently a paper published looking at the relationship between pain and ASMR, and this idea that ASMR might have an analgesic type effect. So that's very interesting. There's some stuff that we've been doing more recently, looking at ASMR and sensory sensitivity. So a paper just published in the Journal of Research and Personality looked at ASMR and its relationship to various different kinds of sensory sensitivity. So some things that we found, for example, that ASMR is very much related to the highly sensitive person concept. So if people are familiar with that, people who experience ASMR are much more likely to be defined as highly sensitive. They're also more likely to be more aware of the connection between their bodily states and their emotional states as well. So that was interesting. We just published a paper looking at the overlap between ASMR and Mirrortouch synesthesia. So if you're not familiar with Mirrortouch, this is a kind of synesthetic type response where people will experience felt touch when they see somebody else being touched. So let's say if I touch my finger like that, you might feel it in that location, for example. And we have some interesting kind of findings which suggest that Mirrortouch synesthesia is much higher in the ASMR population. That's not to say that they're the same thing, because I think it was in our sample of ASMR and non-ASMR participants, we had, I think it was 18 Mirrortouch synesthetes, and 17 of those were from the ASMR group. So 17 out of 18 people had ASMR, they had Mirrortouch.
High correlation.
Yeah, really high. And actually Mirrortouch type sensations are much more common in ASMR, and also people who report having stronger ASMR too. So people who score higher on ASMR sensitivity. So we're very much interested in kind of the relationship between ASMR and touch. And in that same study, we also looked at people's self-reported experiences to positive and negative tactile events. So whether they enjoy hugging people or whether they might feel uncomfortable if somebody, stood too close to them, things like that. And we find that people with ASMR have much more positive attitudes towards pleasant tactile encounters than people who don't experience ASMR. And these might kind of tap into this idea that touch is a very important trigger for ASMR, whether it's sort of simulated touch, as is often the case in YouTube videos, or actual touch, as many people will report that is a very strong inducer of ASMR. I think we often forget that touch is a trigger in real life because we have so much content that's mediated over things like YouTube. So those are the kind of some things that have come out in terms of research findings. And then we have been doing this big collaborative project involving members of the ASMR community like yourself, and also researchers from different domains. So people who work on misophonia, people who work on music-induced chills, people who work on synesthesia, people involved in kind of who are interested in kind of things like music and, linguistics and all sorts of different areas. And we asked people to generate questions that they thought were important for ASMR research over the next kind of 20 years. And we got this amazing response from, I think, over 100 people had contributed questions. And we went through the process of going to come up with common themes, so big, broad questions of what we think ASMR should be researching. So we came up with, I think, 13 broad topics, and then we had everybody vote on those topics again in terms of whether they thought they were, the most or least important. And then we analysed all that data to come up with a kind of a list of here is the research agenda that we should be focusing on over the next kind of 20 years for ASMR research. And we're writing this up for publication, and everyone who's involved will be co-authors. But in terms of the kind of the headlines of the things that were the most important, I've got them up here so I can sort of say.
Yeah, please. We would love to know. Yeah. Whatever you feel comfortable sharing,
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you the top three. Let's give you the top four most
Please,
important.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
This was just generally across all respondents. We have some other kinds of analyses, but these are the kind of top four. The first one that was rated as the most important was trying to understand the definition, conceptual clarification, and measurement of ASMR. Now, this relates a lot to actually what we've spoken about already in terms of how do you define ASMR? How do you measure it? Is it relaxation? Is it the tingling? What aspects of it are really important? So that was rated as number one. And that's really important, I think, because it's this kind of at the start of researching something new, you need to define it and be able to measure it, right? So these are kind of the very basic questions that probably need to happen first. And we have made some progress towards them, but there's probably a lot more that we can do. So that was number one. The second one is the origins and development of ASMR, which I think is probably the big question in terms of, why is it that some people are capable of experiencing this and other people aren't? How does it emerge in development? Is it something, as you've asked about, biological? Like, what's going on? And so those are the really kind of big types of questions that we should be starting to tackle in terms of why does this thing happen in a certain proportion of the population and not in the rest of the population. The third one was the neurophysiology of ASMR. So again, this relates to some things that we've already spoken about, but this is trying to understand what is going on in the brain and in the body when people experience ASMR, or are there kind of trait-like differences in people's kind of neural organization and things like that that distinguish ASMR from non-ASMR or ASMR experiences from non-ASMR experiences. So we already have made some headway on this in terms of the physiology and what's going on in the brain. But again, because this is expensive work, this is probably going to take quite a bit of funding. But hopefully now that we've established it as a priority, that will be a good justification to get more research on this. And then the fourth one was understanding ASMR triggers. So trying to understand the specific triggers. What is it that makes something an ASMR trigger? Are there common properties in terms of the acoustic characteristics of ASMR elicitors and things like that? And there's we're already doing some kind of ongoing work on that in terms of trying to understand the acoustic properties of it. But
absolutely, it's fascinating.
That is a kind of a little mini synopsis of what came up, but there will be a paper to report officially on the results of the Delphi study. And it was great getting comments and ideas from a range of different people and really trying to involve the community as much as possible, even though it can be really hard. But we really think that people, it's not just scientists that need to be researching this, and people's own experiences and own thoughts about ASMR are really valuable to us as well.
Absolutely. It was really cool being a part of it because I think for me, I'm mostly involved talking to, my girlfriend also loves ASMR, so I do get to have a personal one-on-one with regards to that, but most of it's other ASMR artists. So for the most part, I do think it is a specific view about ASMR, and it's definitely more YouTube based, so I think it's 100% tied to YouTube only, basically. Otherwise, you don't really know who else experiences. But I think being in that room with other scientists and other people who came at it from a different perspective. That was really cool, especially when we were determining what research priorities and voting on it, because the ASM artists had one specific thing, and the researchers are more interested, like you said, like in the measurement and things like that, because obviously the scientific method and everything is so important for your research. And so I think that was just super interesting. One other thing I thought would be really interesting would be like animal studies as well, because I'm pretty sure I learned this from you, but I think there's a connection between grooming habits and primates, something there. And it would be interesting to obviously see if that, the connections there in the animal kingdom as well. So, just 10 years, 20 years down the road, when it can be done. There's so many different fields that can come into this. So actually, and I think this is actually a really good time to transition. We only have about, I would say, just 14 minutes left, and pretty much that leaves us maybe 2 questions here. So I really think it's important to, maybe you could talk about some of the other researchers on the team or on this call, or who are also involved with the just ASMR research in general. Is there anybody you might want to just give a little shout out to or anything like that?
Well, I mean, there's tons of people. So of course, I can't not mention Craig Richard, ASMR University, and he has done an incredible amount for the ASMR community from very, very early on. So I always think he's fantastic. And his ASMR TEDx talk was posted on the ASMR on the TED main webpage. So definitely check that out. It's really great to see ASMR in the spotlight a bit more. So I can't, thank him enough for all the work that he's done. He's been such a wonderful support for everything. So of course him. In terms of other researchers who are doing interesting work, there's obviously Clownada, who does really interesting stuff looking at more the kind of acoustics of ASMR, and she's doing her PhD at the moment. I think she's close to finishing, and so she's done some really interesting work. Tom Schwartz has also just got his PhD in ASMR. I think it's probably one of the first ASMR PhDers.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah, he's done fantastically well. He has also developed a screening tool to measure if you experience ASMR, so something that we're going to be using a lot in ongoing research. Wow. And there's Aga McEerlin. I'm not sure if I pronounced her surname properly, but she's been doing a lot of work also from the very beginning. She's published a lot on ASMR. And she's recently published the study on pain and ASMR, which I think is fantastic. And she's very interested in it. She also experiences it herself. And then there is Stephen Smith and Bev Freeborg from Canada, who have done so much amazing work on ASMR. So they do a lot of really exciting stuff. They've, I think, published something about the spine and ASMR recently, looking at the spinal cord. So they're an amazing group, have been doing some of the most pioneering research in ASMR. I'll probably forget lots of different people, but there are so many. There's a real contingent of people that are starting to look into this, which is fantastic.
That's so awesome.
So it's great.
That is. Okay, so I think my last questions are all kind of connected. So I would say, could you just quickly explain to people so that they know? I mean, I want to end this with how can we learn more and how can we help? But what is the relationship between the ASMR experiencer and the ASMR researcher? So people can understand. Is there something there that is different, or how can we help each other kind of with moving forward with these kind of studies?
What do you mean? What's the question again? Sorry.
Well, I guess the question is, how can we really help more? How can people who love ASMR or people who are ASMR artists, how can they help the scientific community move forward with their research? Obviously, financially is that's clear, but I mean, other things. Is there anything that we can do to help in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a good question. I mean, we can't do any psychological research really on ASMR without research participants. So taking part in research studies is always really, really valuable. So people can take part in online studies and also ones that we're going to have in person now that the pandemic is hopefully over and we can begin testing in person. So at some point there will be a kind of big call out for research participants to get into a database, and helping with that would be great. The other thing that I think actually we struggle with even more getting people to take part in research. Actually, people who experience ASMR have been fantastic in helping us with our research. It's getting people who don't experience ASMR that's difficult. So if people who experience ASMR know people who don't experience ASMR that are willing to take part in research, that would be even more helpful than them taking part themselves, I think. That's always the struggle. So we really, people in the ASMR community have been so generous in sharing our research and taking part in it and all of those sorts of things. And that's really so useful for us because we can't do it without willing volunteers. And hopefully when we get more funding for things, we'll start being able to pay people to do studies as well, which should hopefully make it easier. But that's the main way that people can help. But of course, if people are interested in kind of helping with kind of research efforts or, helping with research studies, they have an experience or background in any kind of research, I'm always open to people joining the lab to do things. So
I think that'd be an important time because I have one last question after this. And then I think it'd be an important time for maybe just before, so people who are still there, where can people find more about you, or how can they get in touch with you or your team? Where is the best place for them to do that?
Yeah, so the ASMR.net website should be live I think at some point. It's still waiting to be populated. So my colleague Tom Hostler is the main person who's dealing with that, and Tom Schwartz as well. But we will at some point have a location of studies and where you can take part in different studies. But I'm always open to people contacting me over email, and they can find my email online. It's not too hard. I will be moving. We'll put it in the description.
Yeah,
put it in. I will be moving institutions, so I'm going to be going to the University of Sussex in a couple of months. So my email will change, but I'll have my Essex email until December. So people are always welcome to get in contact with me. It might take me a while to reply, but I usually do reply. And then if people are in the UK and they are interested in going to an ASMR exhibition, there is ASMR at the Design Museum, which is a really fantastic immersive ASMR exhibition that I've been a little bit involved with. And there's a research project going on there that people can take part in at the exhibition itself.
Oh, wow. That's actually the second European ASMR exhibition I've heard of. And now I'm jealous. Why am I on this side of the pond?
Well, I think it's the same exhibition, but it's traveling. So you've only missed out on one. Still,
if Miami, then I have my fingers crossed. But but if anyone's out there, and I will say this: if anyone is out there and they have friends who hate their ASMR videos, these are the people you want to reach out to get in touch with Giulia. And then I want to ask this last question here, and then I think we'll just wrap up here. But what about so I've been reading like some of the. I think it's the NIH website and things like that. There are some websites that do host some of the actual studies, but for people who want to learn more just about ASMR and the science, where's a good resource for people to? I mean, and I'm not just necessarily like a CNN article or something, but something that really shows some of the data and things like that. Is there anywhere you recommend people can find more information?
Yeah, so I'd say that Craig Richards' website, ASMR University, has a lot of kind of very good summaries of the research base. A lot of papers, if you want to read original journal articles, a lot of papers are open access, which means that anybody can read them. So, for example, our 2018 paper on ASMR looking at the physiology is open access. Anybody can read it. So I would say just, Google searching and things like that. We will at some point on our website have a kind of digestible ASMR research section, but it's not live yet. But I do think it's important to actually scrutinize the evidence and kind of see what something is telling you. So I would just say read original articles if you're interested. But yeah, if any articles of mine that aren't open access, people can email me and I can send them a copy. Oh, fantastic. Well, that's really great information. And I think this conversation has been very enlightening. Even for me, I wrote down 20 things here. But I don't want my interview to go on for 3 hours. But that all said, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I think that everyone is going to learn something here. And of course, if they want to reach out to you, as you mentioned, we'll put your information here. So that all said, thank you so much for updating us. And we will see you in the next panel as well. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you, Giulia.